What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, big celebrity boxing match coming up, Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz. Now, Nate is a 3.5 to 1 underdog here. A lot of people think he's going to show up undersized, unprepared, a little bit older, obviously, than Jake, and sort of get worked over. How do you see this one playing out, and does Nate actually have a chance?
Well, I actually really do enjoy these Jake Paul matchups now, and I think it was a lot of fun when it first started, but it was just a novelty, and he was going in there and smoking everybody. But he has upped his level of competition every time he's gone out there, and after he stubbed his toe against Tommy Fury and didn't get his hand raised, Nate Diaz feels like the right next step. I don't think if he would have beat Tommy Fury, he would be fighting Nate Diaz. I think they probably would have wanted to see him fight another boxer. But since he lost, he's able to go back into that world that I think is a good world for him. I think it's a money-making world for him, fighting MMA fighters that want the big payday, that are big names from MMA, that are going to bring the MMA fans over to the Jake Paul show. Whereas we know a lot of the boxing world doesn't really want to tune into Jake Paul's fights because they stick their nose up to him and call him a celebrity and not a real boxer, even though he's doing some really cool things in boxing, inside the ring and outside the ring. So I think this was actually the best thing that could ever happen for Jake Paul, to lose to Tommy Fury and come back and get right back in there with people that he actually has a better chance of beating than a lot of people probably think. Nate Diaz is the perfect next opponent.
Yeah, definitely. And talk about fighters that have a full grassroots following. It doesn't get much bigger than the Diaz brothers. They're like a folklore living legend. And Nate is sort of at the forefront of that now. You know, Nick had his day, but that's been some time. And now Nate Diaz, with the Conor McGregor stuff and everything he's done in the octagon thereafter, has really just given his name rise like we could have never really imagined with Nate. We always kind of thought he was going to be in the shadow of Nick to some degree, and that is certainly not the case anymore. And looking at the X's and O's of the fight, I do think that Jake matches up very well against Diaz. He's going to be a lot bigger, a lot stronger, a lot more athletic. But here's where Nate can start to give Jake Paul some trouble. Nate is a cardio machine, and Jake Paul looked fatigued in the fight against Tommy Fury. He was breathing very heavily in those later rounds. Nate is also a technician. Nate was known for two things inside the octagon. That's his really high-level jiu-jitsu and submission game, especially from the bottom, and his boxing. And we even saw him put Leon Edwards on skates. Leon Edwards is the current UFC champion in the 170-pound division, and he was almost finished by Nate Diaz with his hands the last time they fought. So it's going to be interesting. I think Nate can make this fight very close, but in the end, Nate is pushing the 40 mark, and he's going to be a lot smaller. I'm leaning towards Jake Paul here.
Yeah, and it kills me to say this because I'm a massive Diaz fan. Nate Diaz has done so much for the sport, and he's always putting on amazing shows for the fans. But Jake Paul is a larger person. And usually when you're in the UFC, like Nate Diaz was for so long, he's fighting guys that are right there around his same size at the 155 and the 170 range. And even when he was fighting at 170, he was fighting guys that were also coming up from 155. So I think that Jake Paul's size is going to make a bit of a difference. And if we were talking about Nate Diaz being some super elusive, great head movement type of fighter, I think this would be an easy fight for him to win. But Jake Paul is going to land a lot of shots on Nate. Nate Diaz, he takes damage every single time he goes out there. It's almost like he doesn't even try to avoid the damage. And I just worry that if Jake Paul plants his feet and throws some of those big shots, he's going to land on Nate, and it's going to be hard for Nate to recover. Jake Paul doesn't have to be a technician with his striking and doesn't have to be like a sniper with laser pinpoint accuracy. If he can go out there and put his hands on Nate Diaz the same way he did on Tyron Woodley, we could see Nate flat on the canvas. I'm leaning towards this going to decision because I think Nate's durable and tough. But if somebody gets a knockout, I'm kind of leaning towards Jake getting it.
Yeah, and if Nate goes in there and plays around, he's certainly going to be a lot more susceptible to the knockout, which we're all expecting some sort of Nate Diaz antics in the cage, or in the ring, excuse me. We don't know what it's going to be, but if he does get in there and not take it seriously and kind of joke around with Jake Paul, he is standing in front of a very dangerous, very powerful opponent. And it's funny to say when we're talking about Jake Paul in that regard, but he is absolutely that. Jake's in his mid-20s. He's close to 200 pounds when he's not competing, if not heavier than 200 pounds. He's very strong, and he's shown us that he can hit very hard. He put Anderson Silva down. So, it's definitely not something to play around with. Nate's got to be very careful. If he goes in there and he is elusive and he does use some head movement, which I believe he's capable of. I believe it's a lot like Justin Gaethje back in the day, where he has all these tools up his sleeve. He just won't use them. He just wants to go in there and make it exciting and make it a bloodbath. And so I think if he does that, he's going to lose. And if he does stand right in front of him, he probably will get dropped. I'm also along the same lines as you as far as thinking it's going to go to decision, just because of the durability of Nate and how Jake kind of fades in the later rounds. I think it's going to be, if Jake's going to get a knockout, he's going to need to get it early. That's where he's going to have the most pop in his punch. And Nate Diaz, we know he takes the first several rounds off most of the time. He doesn't even start fighting until he's been bloodied up a little bit. So he's going to excel in the later rounds. I'm thinking it's going to be, it's a 10-round fight. I think Jake Paul probably wins 6 or 7 rounds.
Yeah, that's a safe bet. And one thing I really do like about Jake Paul is when it comes time for him to fight, he does a lot of build up for the fight. He promotes it on his YouTube page. So you're getting a lot of content out of the Jake Paul camp. You're seeing what he's doing, how hard he's training. And this guy is taking this stuff very seriously. His recovery, his training, his workout regimen, his eating, everything is dialed in. And I don't know if Nate Diaz is on that same level of commitment right now. He's done so much for the sport for so long, and he's always been a dog in the game. And, back in the day when people didn't know half of what they know now about the nutrition and the health and stuff, Nate was sort of one of those guys that kind of had it locked in back then. But at this stage of his career, I don't think he's as focused as Jake Paul on this fight. And that's why I feel like Jake Paul might come in there and shock the world with a big KO.
I think he probably will.